Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
The book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, was written long ago in 1841 by the Scottish journalist Charles Mackay. Among the madnesses he studied and debunked were haunted houses, fortune-telling, alchemy, the Crusades, witch hunts, dueling, and the tulip bulb mania. It's now October 2020, and it looks like the COVID-19 virus is long behind us, or the worst of it anyway. And yet we are still in the midst of a pandemic of fear that is far worse than any virus. And it's a crisis that has basically divided the country into two camps: open America up or keep it shut down. When the history of the great virus of 2020 is told, I believe it's going to join Mackay's long list of the madness of crowds, perhaps near the top. Fortunately, a history of the pandemic so far has been written, The Price of Panic, and one of its authors, my friend Dr. Jay Richards, is with me today to break it down. Jay is a professor at Catholic University, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, the executive editor of The Stream, and is the author of more than 24 books. Jay, welcome.
Bill, great to be with you.
We were talking about this before the show, but let's talk about your co-authors, because
Sure.
These are you and your co-authors are some fairly serious scientists that bring a lot to this, and it's not some just guys, speculating sitting at the bar. Although, as I understand it, the author discussions involve some of that.
Oh, absolutely. Though honestly, I can tell you. Let me tell you who my co-authors are. Though Matt Briggs, a PhD in statistics from Cornell, has done a lot of work, professional and academic, in statistics. A really smart guy, really smart expert on predictive modeling in particular. And my other co-author, Doug Axe, PhD from Caltech. He's a biologist, was for years at a research facility at Cambridge University and is now in California. And honestly, I don't know how the book could have been written without all three of us, because we all bring something different to the table.
And Matt Briggs has his own website.
He does.
I think he calls it William M. Briggs, Statistician to the Stars.
Statistician to the Stars, exactly. And so I've known him for years, and actually Doug Axe called me in March, because that's how this book got written. Axe, the biologist, called me and said, Jay, somebody's got to write a book on this. This is a disaster. He sort of thought of me because I'm a generalist and can crank books out fairly quickly.
Well, your PhD's in philosophy,
it is.
So you're bringing a moral compass to this,
a moral
which is
compass,
critical.
and I say the kind of generalist. And
well,
so
you also do a lot of
analyzing
economics.
Absolutely.
Which we talked about.
And the book itself has a lot of economics in it, because you're talking about the risks all around, obviously. But there's, most people, when it comes to science, and especially biology, that's just scary to the average person. And so when you get experts that seem to be scientific experts, that scares people. That, look, I don't know anything about that. Maybe I have intuitions, but what am I to do? Who am I to challenge it? And I think that's honestly a major part of the story. That's why the subtitle talks about the tyranny of experts.
Tyranny of experts, yeah. I mean, if we put ourselves in the hands of experts, has been a big issue.
It is.
Now, you and I talked about this with Steve Moore. When was it? I think we looked it up. March 25th?
Late March. That's pretty early.
When this was all just beginning.
Yep.
And did you think we'd still be talking about it in October 2020?
Absolutely not. I mean, we were mortified that the whole world seemed to be in the process of locking down, based at the time on very little actual data and predictive computer models that we learned very quickly were just deeply flawed. But all of us thought, okay, well, we'll finish the book in June. It's not going to be able to come out till October. That's okay. It'll be an after-action report. We hope people still remember what it was like to be locked down. The idea that we would still be doing this in October, I have to confess, I would never have imagined it.
Well, I've broken it into two parts to the way I think about it. One is the pandemic of the virus.
Yes.
And then there's the pandemic of fear.
That's right.
Let's cut to the chase. There's a lot of work done now. that we didn't have the benefit of 6 months ago about how serious this really is and how does it
Absolutely.
compare to other viruses and other
Yep.
other pandemics.
I mean, it doesn't compare at all to other pandemics that most people have heard about. So, for instance, the Spanish flu in 1918, a little over 100 years ago, was far, far, far more severe. It may have killed 50 million people over the period of kind of its main run. There are a couple of pandemics that most people don't know about. The Asian flu, 57, 58, killed 1 million, I think. And then the Hong Kong flu in 67, 68 killed a couple of million, or may have those reversed. Those are sort of in the relevant, at least at the order of magnitude, though this isn't even as severe as that. And I point that out because, you know, if you're as old as we are, you were alive during that flu in 1968, and most people don't even remember it, and it was more severe. Now, so am I saying, oh, this is just an ordinary flu? No. The reality is that flu comes in different varieties, and we deal with it every year. Sometimes it's worse than other times. But I do think it bears now a comparison to the flu. We have a respiratory virus. It's going to be recurring. It's something that kills some people. It makes other people sick, and it has other people that are basically asymptomatic. I think the most important difference between this and the flu is that it's highly selective in who it kills. So there's this gradient that we all know now in terms of age and health. And so if you're, say, 18 or under, you're 4 or 5 times more likely to die from complications of the flu.
Age 80.
Yeah, 18. So
18.
Let's say 18 or under, you're 4
Okay.
or 5 times more likely to die from complications of the flu than from COVID-19. So far more likely. So if you're a high school student or even if you're a college student, this lockdown of colleges is crazy because these kids are at more risk of dying from the flu, right? We don't lock down for the flu. Now you could say, okay, well, professors and staff may be older. That's true. If you're elderly, especially if you're over age 65 and you have severe so-called comorbidities. So let's say you have type 2 diabetes, you have heart disease, you have high blood pressure, you're much more likely to die of complications from this.
Well, let's establish, though, what we mean by not that bad relative to a lot of other flus that have happened. There was a chart you and I were talking about before that there's this, we can talk about cases, but
Yeah.
we really need to talk about our deaths.
That's right.
And so the deaths are the ultimate measure of what, well, everything,
Yeah,
but the death
right.
for this case. And there's a wave of a flu coming through, a seasonal flu,
Yes.
and we have them every year. And the pattern seems to be that if there's a bad flu season one year, there's a low incidence of flu deaths in the next, and if there's a low, a very mild flu, then that builds up people that might otherwise have died in that year.
Exactly.
And there's a terrible term called the crunchy portion of the population,
Right.
which are the older, the more vulnerable.
Yes.
And let me see if I've got this right, and you
Okay.
can correct me. In 2018, we had what they're calling 140,000 excess deaths from the flu. That's because 2017 was very mild and weren't very many deaths, and a lot of people were more vulnerable. 2019 was a very mild flu season,
Right.
and not many people died, and the curve fell below whatever you measure it. And then this year that we're concerned about, there are like 180,000 excess deaths.
Yeah.
So it's not that different
It's not.
from 2018. Is that accurate?
It is, and this is tough, and most people don't know that even with the flu, the way we figure out flu deaths is not by literally counting them. It's based in part on these complex calculations after the fact on excess deaths. And I think the key thing to remember, well, a few things, but one is that everyone has a limited lifespan and ultimately dies of something. And so if you're thinking about this from a public health perspective, you got to keep that in mind, right? And so the closer a person gets to death, especially if they have these comorbidities, the more likely they are to end up dying as a result of complications from something that would not have posed all that much of a risk in the past. Well, what this does is COVID-19 sort of occupies that same public health space as the flu would normally. It's just that in this case, it's occupying the same space partially simultaneously. So with COVID-19, whereas you have a normal flu season that sort of starts in the fall, and then it dips in the spring. And then there's this complicated thing in hot places where people get together inside because it's so hot, and there can sometimes be a spike there. COVID-19 came online, if you will, a few months late. And so that's why the curve, though it looks a lot like the flu curve, it's shifted more toward the late spring. It's because it didn't work, it didn't find its way into the population until maybe November or December. We don't know exactly in China, but we should expect that it's going to be very much like the flu. Now, when people say that, that's a neuralgic thing to say because people think that you're trivializing it. No, the flu can be deadly.
Wait, neuralgic.
It could sort of set people off as if you're saying, oh, it's trivial. I know someone that died of this. I know someone that a cold almost killed me in 2016 from complications.
Yeah.
So that can happen. And so it's not like we're trivializing the flu. We're just saying, let's put this in perspective. This is not Ebola. This is not an organ melting virus that kills a third of the
Do
population.
you personally fear the flu, fear the virus?
I would say I moderately fear that if I get it, only because I'm not 25, and I've had pneumonia twice, and I had pleural effusion, which is a lung problem, but I certainly don't spend any time panicking about it. I take sort of regular precautions, but it doesn't sort of occupy my mind in the way it does my neighbors who seem to be terrified when they see me jogging outside without a mask.
Well, yeah. Or they would be driving alone in the car with a mask.
Yes, absolutely. And I can say that near where I live, I see a lot of this, unfortunately.
So, in your book, what do you conclude about where we are, and I mean, and how we ought to deal with where we are, just in terms of containing the flu? I want to talk about the fear or the virus.
The virus, yes, this coronavirus.
What's the takeaway? What should we be doing?
The takeaway is that we should do what we do with respect to other respiratory bugs. And so especially, I mean, we're now at the end of it. If you'd asked me, okay, what should we have done in April? I would have said quarantine the people that we know are sick.
Right.
That's what a quarantine is. It's isolating sick people from everyone else. And try to protect the people we know are at really high risk. So elderly people that are in nursing homes, for instance. That's not a quarantine so much as an isolation. And then let everybody else do what we normally do during the flu season. Remember, okay, who are you interacting with? Are you at a special risk of respiratory illness? And you allow people to make those kinds of decisions. And you don't shut down the economy and destroy hundreds of thousands of people's lives as a result of your response.
What's the science behind a 6-foot distancing rule?
The science is, it's very hard to nail any of this stuff down. Obviously, it's impossible to get randomized control trials, right? How do you do that? Okay, we're going to have two sets of people that are exactly alike. One is
this group's going to volunteer. This is skins and shirts.
Exactly.
You got to go volunteer to stand 2 feet.
And you're going to be, there's no way to do that. And so all of this is on what's called mechanistic plausibility. So if the virus is spread by particles and droplets and things like that, right? And they tend to fall to the ground if you give them some time. And, then you can kind of come up with some arbitrary distance, and you say the farther are you away from someone, the less likely you are to get it, right? That's the idea. But there's no solid scientific data that this makes much difference.
Well, my understanding is, and correct me but that since the pandemic in 1918, the rule of thumb has been 3 feet. Mm-hmm. But at this time, somebody in the UK in January decided somehow, let's be extra safe, and made it 6 feet.
Yeah.
And it's made all the world of difference in terms of sports events, restaurants, public gatherings of any kind.
Yeah.
If you had 3 feet, that's sort of mostly manageable.
It is. Well, the reality is that at least I'd say Northern Europe, as someone who's been to lots of countries in Europe, right? Even in Europe, people's comfort with social physical distance varies. You get to Northern Europe, people don't stand more than 3 feet from each other, but you get to 6 feet, it's just weird, right? It's almost impossible.
You mean all the talk shows we see on TV now where people
it is, and
or presidential press conferences.
Yeah, and it's sort of based on this, okay, look, if you are in New Hampshire and somebody else is in South Dakota, you're not going to exchange the virus, right? So the idea is that there's this kind of linear relationship, and so what's the kind of sweet spot in terms of distance where we can maybe still get around, but maybe reduce the virus. But it's all just conjecture.
But the three of you, do the three of you authors, do the three of you agree on a safe distance?
No, we don't really we don't think that there is one.
Okay.
Yeah, we just don't think that there is one.
What about masks?
So, masks are complicated because remember at the beginning they were disadvised, if that's a word, right? We were told don't wear them. You shouldn't wear them, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden in June it became a sort of intellectual orthodoxy that you have to wear it. Now, it's complicated, but what I would say is, okay, look, if you're a medical professional and you're around an infectious disease, and you're wearing a properly fitted N95 mask, right? That's the whole point. N95 means it's going to limit 95% of the particulate matter that comes in. Of course, an individual virus could come in, but viruses travel around in aerosols or in droplets. It's going to probably make some difference. That's sort of common sense. And if you wear a surgical mask and you're a surgeon, that's going to reduce the spit that's coming out, right? But how relevant is that to the ordinary person? Well, it's probably not. There's absolutely no data that everyone wearing masks as we actually wear them, right? Which we wear them over and over, we touch the outsides. There's no evidence, one, that this makes any difference. And there's a lot of reason to think that unless you're really careful, it could actually be be actually counterproductive. I mean, just think of the mask, right? So I wear a surgical mask when I go to the gym because I have to. Let's assume that the gym I go to is just riddled with virus particles floating around. I walk around in there for an hour breathing through this mask, and a bunch of that stuff is now concentrated on the surface of the mask.
So it actually collects it
Yeah,
rather
it's actually
than repels
collected
it.
there. And so this is sort of the least
Yeah,
safe
great.
surface in the gym now. If I touch it, well, all bets are off.
You're watching The Bill Walton Show, and I'm here talking with my friend Dr. Jay Richards, author of The Price of Panic, and we're talking about the impact of the COVID-19 panic that's going on as we speak. And right now we're talking about whether masks work, social distancing, and all the prophylactic measures we might take to protect ourselves from this. So Jay, what is it about are we out of the lockdown phase in this country? Are we still being locked down?
We're still being locked down. The fact that you can't go to church or go to mass or synagogue, the fact that the students at Catholic University, only freshmen can come on campus, and only 15 at a time.
So
That's
it's not
a
really
form of
locked down, we're locked out.
Locked
we're locked
out.
out.
We're locked
the
out.
term needs to change to locked out
That's
from
a good
gathering.
point. Yeah. Exactly. And so we're not exactly under house arrest like they seem to be in Victoria, in Australia,
which
is
New
essentially
Zealand,
now.
it's crazy.
It's basically a police state.
Yeah.
That's just the reality. You're right. We're in a kind of a lockout phase. And honestly, I think a lot of this is the result of the fact that that officials, having already done certain things, don't want to now reassess the evidence. Nobody wants to hear, okay, when you stayed in your house for 3 months and everybody else was made to stay in their house, that probably didn't do anything. In fact, it may have made things worse. Nobody wants to sort of admit, okay, that was dumb, let's do something else. And so there's this incentive to keep dribbling this out, because the alternative would be to admit that was probably a terrible idea.
So McKay has a quote that I think is pretty well known. It says, men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds.
Yes.
While they recover their senses only slowly and one by one.
Wow. And what would he have thought of social media, in which we have direct access to extreme outlier events in real time at the speed of light in video form on our bodies?
Well, let's dig into that. Talk about the social media's effect of accelerating whatever the bad things are coming from this.
We're convinced that this is the key thing, that this is what makes this different from everything else. You can always say, well, the media hates the president, which is true, and that's a relevant fact. The media has an incentive to terrify people, which is true, but that's always been true. I mean, it's scary stuff. You get clicks, you get eyeballs. What happened now that didn't happen in 2009, under President Obama, we had a type of flu that was really worrisome. We had social media, we had smartphones, but we just had them for a couple of years. What we didn't have is the sheer ubiquity of social media and the kind of immediacy of it. And so if you look at the penetration of social media, smartphones, really fast internet connections in which you can watch video, what we now have is all of these things. The social nature of human beings, the fact that we're herd animals, we just are. We're social beings, that's how we're made. Add to that the incentives of the media in the United States to hate the president and to always be adversarial now under whatever happens, and then add social media and its immediate effects. And I think it required all of those things in order to have the kind of social pandemic that we're experiencing. I'd say this is the first real global social pandemic that we've ever had. None of the examples that Mackay talked about in his book, of course, were global. They were in the Netherlands or maybe the Crusades.
Tulip Bowl.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This was global. It's not like it's just happening in the United States. And in fact, there are just a few outlier countries surprisingly like Sweden, that somehow managed to resist it. Otherwise, almost everyone has participated in this.
So you call it the social
Social pandemic.
So that's
Yeah.
sort of what I think is the pandemic of fear. Is that
That's
the
right.
same thing?
Exactly.
I mean, we're really this.
Exactly. There's two contagions. There's a viral contagion and there's the social contagion. And the social contagion will ultimately be much more destructive of lives and property and well-being than the viral contagion has been.
Well, yeah, I mean, the number of cancer cases
Oh,
is
yeah.
probably going up. People aren't being treated, they aren't being tested, we're not
That's
getting
right.
vaccines, the emotional cost of
Oh,
being locked
it's
down.
going to be catastrophic and it'll last for years.
Yeah, well, Jim Agresty's written about that,
He has.
Just Facts. and
Yes.
He's got some great statistics. He thinks the number of deaths related to the lockdowns could be 10 or 20 times, maybe more. The
Perhaps.
deaths related to the virus.
Yeah, at the moment, this is what's frustrating about it, is that we're having to conjecture based on sort of isolated data. But we know already in March, for instance, that many suicide hotlines, we're seeing 300% increases from the year before. That was just right at the beginning. We'll be able to figure this out after the fact with excess deaths compared to other years. I think it's realistic that we could have as many people from missed diagnoses and treatments. Easily, those will equal the deaths from COVID-19. And when you talk about disruption of food supply chains in the developing world, so the places where people are already right on the edge, even the UN Food Program predicts that we could have up to hundreds of thousands of deaths per day. Even if they're off by an order of magnitude, very quickly you exceed the deaths from the bug itself.
So but because of the pandemic of fear, we're really not able to go things back. You go back to where things were. If you think
Yeah.
about sending kids back to school, kids don't get this.
No, they don't.
They don't.
I mean,
They don't get particularly sick. They certainly
Yeah.
don't die.
yeah, there's of course the weird isolated case, and I assure you that CNN will tell us about that case and treat it as if it's representative.
Well, one of my friends who's a politician admitted to me, he was a congressman, he said, Bill, we legislate by anecdote. In other words, we get a good story and then all
Absolutely.
of it, so we don't do it the way Jay Richards
No.
would do it with statistics and math and balance, or the way I would do it.
Yeah.
Risk and reward.
No.
Anecdote. Well, but one of the things about the schools, I want to see if you guys have done any work on this one. Somebody said to me last night, well, yeah, you could send the kids back, but the teachers are at risk. I said, well, they're still, most of them are pretty young. And she said, well, no, most of the teachers are pretty old, and a lot of them are, 40% of America is obese now,
That's a problem.
and 40% of teachers are obese.
Okay, so they're representative.
So they're in a comorbidity group.
Yes.
What do you do about that?
Well, this is the problem. But see, this is true of almost anything, right? And so, if you have severe lung problems, if you're rational, are much more careful about
Yeah.
catching things like the flu. You've probably gotten the vaccines for pneumonia. I have, right? And so, but that's the kind of thing you do in a free society, is that you give people proper, accurate information, and then you allow them to make these kind of calculations. I think that's right. This bug would be dangerous to someone that's very obese, especially if they have type 2 diabetes, and let's say they're a 65-year-old teacher. They're at much more risk. That's true.
So you'd ask the teachers to self-assess.
Yeah, self-assess and make compensation. We're doing that at Catholic University. And so professors were given the option, okay, do you feel like you're safe coming in, or do you want to do it online? We've set up a hybrid system in which if you're teaching freshmen, you might have kids in your classroom, and then you have some that are actually online in Zoom, and you're doing it simultaneously. And we sort of built out for that. So that was all available, but nevertheless, we still weren't free to sort of calculate these things. We're under these very severe restrictions, and that's true around the country.
Well, when you think about it, we've got a government-mandated, one-size-fits-all regime, and if there's anything that we know doesn't work as microeconomists, it's
Right.
one-size-fits-all.
That's right. This idea that you're going to have this centralized response to this, I mean, all you have to do is compare different countries. I mean, if you look at Vietnam, which didn't have a lockdown, has almost no deaths. We've been hearing about how horrible it was going to be in sub-Saharan Africa, where people sort of guess, okay, people are poorer, they have less access to health care, it's going to be much worse.
Yeah.
They're weirdly almost immune to it. And so the reality is there's a bunch of stuff that we don't know, a bunch of stuff we do know. And at this point, we know who's at high risk in our population and who is at low risk. And this idea that we're going to just kind of sort of impose this one-size-fits-all response on everyone. I mean, all it's doing is prolonging the pain in other ways.
Well, this gets us back to how this all got started. What is it? Go ahead and tell me
Yeah.
the history of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
China,
Yes.
World Health Organization, the Imperial College London. I mean, there's some players in the story.
There are players in the story. I mean, look, let's accept the fact that its origins are scary. It came from China. Asia is known to be a source of scary viruses. That's why we have a thing called the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu. And so that's sort of scary. There was a movie made, I think it was 2013, Contagion, that was about a virus that actually came from a bat, believe it or not. The whole story sounds the same. It was very deadly. So
was it a Chinese bat?
It was a bat in China, believe it or not.
So you can't do that now.
No.
Hollywood won't make films
Well, they put
where
it
China's
in,
the
no,
villain.
that's right. This was 2013.
Okay.
And so it's scarily similar, except that virus was much more deadly. So we didn't know what was happening, right? So President Trump actually was careful at the beginning. He restricted travel from China. He was attacked, incidentally, for doing that, right? So we didn't know what we were dealing with in January and February. That's the reality. Then you have the World Health Organization, which is the UN's public health entity. They have to sort of make a call. And so Director General Tedros, who is incidentally a communist from Ethiopia, decided to run with this model from the Imperial College London, and that's what initially terrified
And that
everyone.
predicted, what, 3.5% deaths?
About basically 3.4% fatality rate. Several million people in the United States, maybe 40 million people dead worldwide, unless we did major lockdowns, based on nothing but the assumptions that they plugged into the model.
And anybody who works with models, and I work with models as an economics and statistical guy, they're wrong.
Well, I mean, you can kind of try if you have data to compare them to.
They're fun to play with.
Yeah, they're fun to play with.
You don't run your life on them.
And so the first thing you want to do is say, does the model reflect what's happened in the past? Okay, then it's not totally crazy. Then you want to add data and say, does it predict what's going to happen? And then that's the way you test it. We didn't have that. And in fact, the whole thing, as some engineers said a month afterwards, said the thing is a buggy mess, more like a bowl of pasta than a sort of well-run computer
How
program.
different is it to model a virus impact on a population as compared to an economic model?
It's the same problem, is that you're trying to predict human behavior. And if anything, with economics, we know that people respond to incentives. We know they respond to supply and demand. And so if you're sticking with sort of microeconomic knowledge, those can be somewhat useful. Of course, we know that the models that involve all sorts of complex predictions end up going wrong. When you're dealing with a virus like this, you're dealing with essentially an infection. First, you have to guess, okay, how infectious is it? How deadly is it? And then what do people do when they don't know about it? And what do people do when they find out about it? And so all you can do is really guess. And then, in fact, that's what they did. They made a bunch of guesses, always erring on the side of catastrophe, which is Neil Ferguson, the lead scientist in this.
That was at Imperial College.
Yeah, at Imperial College London. This has been his pattern for a couple of decades now, is to make completely outlandish predictions that are orders and orders of magnitudes off. He's never suffered any harm to his career as a result of it.
Well, is this where the plot gets political and sinister?
Yeah.
Because there are agendas.
China
has an agenda.
Absolutely.
China does not have our well-being
absolutely
in
not.
mind. There's a left-right divide.
Yep.
And there's the obvious thing to make Trump look bad.
That's right.
The economy in the United States is roaring.
Yeah.
He's likely to coast to re-election.
That's right.
It seems like a lot of people grasp on this. I believe that.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt in my mind about it. We have a number of people that actually admitted that. We had people on the left side of the political spectrum in the United States over and over said, "Oh, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to transform society, to remake the economy, to push through lots of our policies." Now, do I think people sort of made it up to do that? Of course not. The point is that people act according to incentives, and the people that communicate all these things to the public almost uniformly had an incentive to weigh in favor of extreme panic. And so I honestly think the media and those that control social media that just didn't tell us the truth about this thing and that exaggerated, they bear, I think, the bulk of the blame for what's happened.
Well, and most journalists didn't major in math or statistics. They're enumerate generally.
Generally
so
enumerate.
So you give them an
yes.
economic story or statistical story, they're not going to run with that. They're
Absolutely
going to
not.
run with the anecdote.
Absolutely not. Unless they will run with worst case scenario numbers. So if you tell them 40 million are going to die, it needs to be a round number. That's really, really good if you want it to be sticky news. But if you start talking about the complex variables or something, it disappears.
You're watching the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Jay Richards, co-author of The Price of Panic, and we're talking about now the sources of what has become a panic and the political nature of how this actual virus has been manipulated for one cause or the other. It's an interesting story. And I want to ask Jay about the World Health Organization in China. Now, we've attributed the World Health Organization all sorts of wonderful, benign characteristics, yet it's pretty clear the guy that runs it is a real captive of the Chinese Communist Party.
There's absolutely no doubt about that. And in fact, even mainstream media sources late in the spring finally admitted this. You know, there's a famous a deputy director. So it's Director General Tedros, who is a scientist from Ethiopia. People often don't know he's literally a communist. He was a leader in their ethno-nationalist Communist Party. He is the head of the World Health Organization. There was a great interview, I think it was in April, with a Hong Kong-based media outlet with one of the deputies of Director Tedros, in which he was actually asked about Taiwan. So she was asking him about various things that happened in China, and she said, well, what about Taiwan? They've done very well. Can you say something about that? And the video went off.
Well, and of course, China won't let you talk about
You're not allowed
Vietnam.
to talk about, well, in Taiwan they don't think of that, they don't treat that as a separate country, right? And so they called him back up, and she asked the question again, and he said, well, we've already talked about China, let's talk about something else, and then just refused to answer the question. It was so bad that they ended up, they ended up actually taking his bio off the English-speaking part of the website. It was so embarrassing. But it was clear he was carrying water for China.
Well, the Chinese won't even let commercial airliners have the name Taiwan on their charts. If you want to land in Beijing, you can't recognize that Taiwan exists.
And nobody wants to talk about Taiwan. My co-author, by the way, Matt Briggs, was there during the entire writing of this book. So he got,
in Taiwan.
In Taiwan.
Okay.
He went over there for work. And he stayed there until the summer when the book was turned in. He said, look, the Taiwanese, this is true generally in East Asia, as people are quick to wear masks. So all of a sudden you're seeing a lot of masks, but they didn't have the lockdowns we had. They had private assessments if you might have been at risk, and you just send a text. It was nothing like the level of insanity, and they actually did really well.
Well, if he's in Taiwan, he's close to the China phenomenon.
Yes.
What's his take on this?
I mean, he thinks that exactly what it appears to be is that the World Health Organization was carrying water for Beijing. Beijing, that is, I'm talking not about the Chinese people, of course. I'm talking about the communist regime in China is a major funder of the World Health Organization. You have a communist that's at the head. You have people below him clearly carrying water for Beijing. And so I think that I think this is documented that for 5 or 6 weeks, the World Health Organization managed to essentially protect what was happening in China, which made this worse. Not just in the sense that the virus was able to get out, but in the sense that we didn't know what we were dealing with. We should have known what we were dealing with in January or February. We didn't figure it out.
Does it
until
matter
March.
whether or not it was created in the Chinese lab or it came from the wet market?
It matters a little bit in that I think the wet market story, I honestly think that's the cover story, because that's people, first of all, it appeals to American and Western prejudices. If you've ever been to a Chinese wet market, they seem exotic.
I've only seen about 5 seconds of a clip.
I mean, I've been
seen
to
enough.
these.
They basically have live animals.
They have live animals,
and they kill them right there for
Absolutely.
you. Yeah.
I've been in wet markets where you have the cow's head in the back of the stall. I mean, it's fresh, but it's sort of scary to us that are not used to it. So that appeals to our prejudices. And in fact, I think it's highly likely, not that it was intentionally released, but that it accidentally leaked from this Wuhan Institute of Virology. I think it was probably because they were doing research on bats and it got out.
But I don't think you agree. That's not really the crime. The crime is how they let it spread.
Absolutely.
I mean, China shut down flights to the rest of China from Wuhan, but let people fly to Switzerland, let people fly to California.
Which tells you they seem to have known more than they were letting on.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. I think the leak is a security breach, which, by the way, the State Department 2 years before this happened had already issued a report saying we're worried about this virology institute with their security protocols. That's one thing, right? But then basically to cover up exactly what was happening for all those weeks, I think ended up making the thing much worse.
Do you all get into the book on the governors and their role in this?
Yeah,
Let's talk about the governors.
The states. So I mean, the nice thing, for all the accusations that President Trump is a fascist and an authoritarian, he respected federalism. It's like the president's role, he can't do the things that mayors and governors generally do have police power for calling on quarantines, for imposing martial law if they have to. The nice thing about it is that we actually, after the fact, we have a way of comparing different responses. And so you have South Dakota, which didn't lock down at all. I have Oklahoma that didn't lock down at all. We have Florida, which did a sort of partial lockdown early on and then opened up, and then you have New York and New Jersey. The long and the short of it is there's basically no correlation between what happened and whether states had government-imposed lockdowns at all. You can look at the death curves, you can look at the case curves, and if I didn't tell you when the government lockdowns happened in those states, you wouldn't be able to figure it out from the data.
So we're talking about a virus, and the thing that has mystified me is my understanding of viruses as a layman is that you really cannot control their spread.
You can't control them. There are things, I mean, obviously, if a virus is on an island, right, and nobody comes from the island, it's a respiratory virus, and you don't get anything, at
But
the limit.
an open society like
Right.
Western Europe and the United
Exactly.
States or Australia, you cannot.
Realistically, without some kind of absurd thing that would create more catastrophe than the virus itself, you cannot literally shut everyone down.
Which
And
is
it's
what they tried to do in New
They tried to
Zealand.
do. That's right. It's what they're-
Unsuccessfully.
Unsuccessfully. It doesn't work. And the reality is, I mean, no one is willing to talk about this idea of herd immunity. And it's, again, right now, it seems to be outside the Overton window of acceptable conversation. But the reality is that with a virus like this, it's very selective in who it harms, right? Especially, so think of who are the people that are most likely to get really sick and die, or also the people in our population least likely to be active in the economy. And so why wouldn't we spend all of our effort protecting them and then let the people use their best judgment that are not at high risk? What you'd want is that people that aren't high risk would build up more immunity to it, and then the people that are at really high risk are less likely to get it from them later. Instead, the most that I think we've probably done is rather than having a kind of normal curve, is we have this weird kind of hit and miss. And I would say that because if you look at Sweden, the curve is basically what you would expect, and now they're back to normal. They're much more likely that their population is not going to have to deal with this again because they did crazy stuff the first time around.
So the herd immunity, you mentioned the Overton window. That's just real quickly. That's for conversations
Yes.
outside the realm of respectability.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now Scott Atlas, I notice, it's
Yes.
from Stanford, who I think is
He's
brilliant,
great.
is now sitting in the press conferences, and last night he was part of President Trump's press conference. And isn't Scott Atlas somebody that's been sort of banned from polite society because he believes that herd immunity is real?
Well, I mean, everyone believes herd immunity is real. He was banned because he said we need to just push herd immunity, by which the media meant cause people, try to get them sick. Yeah, let's have a COVID-19 party, right? That's not what it means. And so he's had to say, no, that is not what I'm talking about, right? I'm not advocating that. No one's advocating that, right? But the idea is that, look, with a viral, infection that spreads its way through a population like this, especially now that we know how it differentiates between different segments of the population, short of a vaccine, and by the way, we've never had an FDA-approved vaccine for a coronavirus, so that may take a lot longer than we realize.
How many coronaviruses have there been?
Oh, I don't know exactly how many. Some the common cold often
So
caused by
30, 40,
coronaviruses.
50.
Yeah, whatever
in the
they
last
are.
few decades.
Yeah, and so there's this. Think of this as a subset of these things we call viruses.
Yeah.
We have. We have, of course, a flu vaccine. It's a different kind of virus. So we have to have a new one every year. It mutates much more quickly than this one does. We just aren't good at producing vaccines for some reason for coronaviruses. And we remember we had 2 weeks to slow the spread initially. That was the initial argument is, look, everybody's going to get it, or that's going to get it.
We had this term flatten the curve.
Flatten the curve, which had a logic to it, right? So if everybody is eventually going to get it, we don't want to overwhelm the healthcare system.
Let them get it slowly rather than quickly.
Exactly, because what you don't want is excess deaths because of triage.
Yeah, that's the natural curve for every virus. It goes
they're
up right
always gonna-
away
yeah.
because the most vulnerable get hit.
That's right.
And then as they get hit, it goes down, 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 down.
That's
down.
right.
That's the slope for all viruses.
Exactly. They
forever.
look basically the same. And
Yeah.
the idea was that, okay, we're not going to be able to prevent that. And even the original curve, if you look, you got a big curve and you got a flat one, it's the same area under the curve. So in other words, the same number of cases in both scenarios. And everyone recognized that. We're not going to reduce the number of total cases, say, over the year. We might be able to slow them down a little bit to reduce sort of, the number of people hitting the hospitals.
Have hospitals recovered from this?
Well, I mean, the depressing
Because
thing-
there was no flood of.
It didn't happen.
No, that's
no,
what I
it
mean.
didn't happen. There were places in which they were under pressure in New York and New Jersey, but it was not even enough under pressure that we used the Javits Center, for instance, or we used the Navy ship that was docked off Manhattan. We didn't use those. But what happened is it was sort of a 2 weeks or 15 days to flatten the curve, right? Well, 2 weeks came and went, and then all of a sudden, we're continuing these lockdowns to try to prevent cases, which we had been told 2 weeks before. Well, we can't do that. I mean, people are going to get this. We might be able to slow down how many get it at once. And so now, all these months out, people don't realize they changed the argument on us, and the argument that we're using is based on a kind of illiteracy about how these viruses actually work.
How about hydroxychloroquine?
We don't talk a lot about that in the book, just because it's not what the book is about, but having looked at
It's another banned subject.
It is. It's another banned subject. It's quite clear to me, I think, at this point, that for the right people that are treated early on with hydroxychloroquine and zinc, that it seems to make a major difference. That is, for people that are treated early on. In fact, one of the hypotheses of why Africa seems to be doing so well is that, of course, in Africa, people take a lot of anti-malarial medications, and it may be that that has a prophylactic effect. Now, we don't know that. It's just a hypothesis. But I think that's a kind of an additional suggestive bit of evidence that this makes a difference.
So is there any chance that'll come back into common use, because it's been used without any side effects and for treating other things
Absolutely.
for decade after decade after decade?
For lupus, people take it or something like it. Americans do before we go to Africa, or you go to some place that has a high sort of malarial likelihood. It's not, it's been safe for decades. This is an example of the kind of political hysteria that was almost, I think, entirely driven by an anti-Trump bias on the part of the media.
And
Trump said something good about it, so they had to attack it.
Well, the anti-Trump piece also shows up in the way the story is being reported now, is that we're not talking about hospitalizations anymore because there are very few.
Right.
And we're not talking about deaths because
right.
there are even fewer of those. We're talking about cases.
Yes.
And there's a lot of testing.
Of course.
And there's a lot of so-called cases, but many people who test positive, they call it a case, they have no symptoms.
No, exactly. And that's a change of what the word meant until just a few months ago.
Explain.
Okay, so a case, essentially, a few months ago, if you said, what's a case? That would be someone who has very specific telltale symptoms of whatever the illness is, and then they test positive for, in this case, the coronavirus. So they have there's sort of active virus in their system, and they're sick because of it, so sick they need to be treated. That would be called a case. And that's because what we don't do is we don't just test everyone, right? Well, now we are doing that massive test. So just in mid-September, one day we actually tested more than 1 million people in a single day. And for months now, we've tested at least 400,000 people a day. Well, if you test lots and lots of people, you're going to get lots of positive tests. Some of those will be false positives, some will be real. But now the media is calling those cases. But very often, these are just people that test positive that are completely asymptomatic. And so we've completely changed the terms now. You test hundreds of thousands of people, you call positive tests cases, and then you talk about a huge increase in cases. What the story should be is, look, even though we're testing and lots of people are testing positive, the deaths and the hospitalizations are going down. That's the lead in the story, but the media is almost uniformly bearing the lead.
Well, you talk about a White House correspondent who was having a TV interviewer who wore a hazmat suit interviews somebody
Yes.
while his cameraman was wearing a T-shirt.
No, exactly. He didn't even have a mask on. It was just absolutely shameless. And this is, and so that makes for good panicky TV. It does not make for good informing of the public.
So we got a couple minutes. How do we get out of this? It seems like you can, if you're going to look at the data, it looks
Yes.
like the virus is pretty much over. Mm-hmm. But the fear virus is not.
It's not. I've looked at the polls. People are still terrified. I think in some ways people are more terrified now than they were for a few months ago. Part of it is because they've been terrified for so many months. I think this is there's a real psychological toll that we're going to be dealing with for years for millions of people that have lived under sort of a period of anxiety and panic. I think the only way out of it ultimately is that a critical mass of Americans finally wakes up to exactly what's going on. I just tell people, I say, look, don't trust me. Just go to the CDC website and see what the actual numbers are. You saw this poll in July as a COVID-19 tracking poll that they asked people what percentage of the population do you think has died as a result of COVID-19? The average guess is 9%. The actual number, even just accepting the truth of the attributed deaths, it's 0.04%. So people think that it's 225.
That's one out of how many 100,000 people?
Well, let's see.
One?
It's not a lot. It's basically 225 times less deadly than the American public thinks it is. And that's CDC numbers, right?
Okay.
And so who's to blame for that? Well, the media is to blame for that.
Well, but also that we've got the governors still. We talked
Yes.
about them. They've enjoyed this run.
Sure. Yeah.
How do they loosen? How do we get the grip loosened?
Well, honestly, I mean, if you think of places like, let's just take Michigan, right, which is still sort of suffering under this. The only way this is possible is if the public complies.
Yeah.
If the public just simply decides not to comply, it's over. But if you have 60% of the public that's still terrified, 20% that doesn't want to rock the boat,
Well,
it
yeah, and
continues forever.
she's the governor there is still very popular,
Absolutely.
even though I think she's been egregious
Absolutely.
in the lockdown.
And so, that's the danger in a democracy, is that as long as most people think it's the right thing to do, it will continue to being done, unfortunately.
What's your conclusion for the book?
Our conclusion to the book is against the brave new normal. We think that the real danger here ultimately is the loss of political and religious freedom, because when governments use emergencies historically in order to extend their power over more and more of society, they're very rare. It's very rare in which they actually retreat from that power. And in this case, governments are doing things that they've never done before. And we just worry that we're going to be used to, as the so-called new normal. We think we need to be against the brave new normal and realize that of all the costs in lives and fortunes, there's the cost of our freedom and of civil society. That's the thing that's ultimately at risk of being lost in the long term. And we want to wake people up to that.
Sounds like a great read. Where can we buy it?
Any place that you can buy books online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, just Google The Price of Panic and it'll come up.
Can we buy it at Costco?
You can buy it at Costco, Walmart, and Target as well.
Oh, that's great. Well, Dr. Jay Richards, author of The Price of Panic, thanks for joining, and thanks for listening and watching The Bill Walton Show, and we'll talk with you next time. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.